Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. Today's video is going to be another aesthetic analysis, and for this video I'm going to be analyzing the Royalcore aesthetic. I'm really excited about today's video, so let's get right into it. Now let's start by defining what the Royalcore aesthetic really is all about. I'm going to be giving you a definition that I found from the Aesthetics Wiki, which was a really helpful source when researching for this video. Royalcore is a term referring to a group of aesthetics based on the visuals of West European royalty, ranging from Arthurian times to the Tudor period. Royalcore revolves around refinement and classic Western standards of behavior. Intelligence, morality, skill, and elegance are the base qualities that give more meaning to the look. End quote. Royalcore as of now mainly focuses on visual characteristics and contexts of historical European monarchies. When we look at the visuals of this aesthetic, we can see that it revolves around castles and the surrounding grounds. We can see many different visual references for this aesthetic, such as training areas, castle gardens, throne rooms, crowns, tiaras, elegant hallways, ballrooms, that sort of deal. Visually, this aesthetic is a very beautiful one to look at, and I find it very calming, which may be why so many people started liking it and why it became a lot more popular. This aesthetic has become a lot more popular over the course of the pandemic, and I thought it would be interesting to share my thoughts and opinions as to why I think this is, since I think that the reasons why things become so popular is kind of interesting. Keep in mind, this is 100% my opinion, and I don't know why this aesthetic all of a sudden became so popular. The best I can do is speculate and make educated guesses. At the core of the word Royalcore, we have the word royal, which refers to kings, queens, that sort of royalty sort of deal. My ongoing theory is that people found themselves drawn more to this sort of aesthetic during the pandemic as an escape for the world. When people were stuck at home, unable to go out, it would have been nice to picture yourself wearing a pretty dress instead of your sweatpants and living in a castle instead of your bedroom. When we look at this graph from Google Trends, we can see that searches for the Royalcore aesthetic really started to increase around November and December of 2020, so more towards the end of the year. This is likely due to people being sick and tired of 2020 and not looking forward to being trapped inside, unable to go out during the winter, and an increase in more escapist fantasies. This aesthetic features a romanticized view of what it would be like to be royalty and be a member of the royal family in the time periods in which it draws its inspiration from. This would be very, very appealing to people wanting to escape their current living situations and the current year. So I honestly think that this theory makes a lot of sense, considering the rise of other aesthetics that give the feeling of freedom, such as the cottagecore aesthetic. When faced with a crisis, it can be nice to fantasize and daydream about happier and simpler times as a coping mechanism for the additional stress placed on us during the pandemic. Another possible reason for the rise in aesthetics that dress in ways that are not considered normal is people feeling restricted by mainstream fashion. People, especially women, are constantly being told how we're supposed to look and what we should be wearing. Dressing in an aesthetic that dresses in a way that is not considered normal by most people, by putting on a dress and a corset, could be freeing to people who are feeling like they're being trapped and caged in by mainstream fashion expectations. The rise of the popularity of the Royalcore aesthetic could also be attributed to the increasingly popular Netflix show Bridgerton. The popularity of the series definitely contributed to public interest in historical fashion, and while the clothing of the Royalcore aesthetic isn't entirely historically accurate, it does have some historical elements incorporated into it. Senior Insights Manager of Pinterest, Swasti Sarna, said in an interview with Nylon that there had been an increase in people using Pinterest to shop for items to add a touch of royalty to their lives. So that's just some background on why the aesthetic all of a sudden became so popular. So now let's start focusing in a little bit more on the fashion. The first thing that I'm going to mention is something that I am very happy to see as a part of such a popular aesthetic. This thing being corsets. I love corsets. I think that they are just so beautiful and elegant looking, and I would be lying if I said that I didn't start loving them so much if it wasn't for the Royalcore aesthetic. Corsets were such a prominent part of historical fashion. Corsets were used to support the bust and large skirts and slightly shape the body to the fashionable standard of the time. For the longest time, corsets were thought of as a torture device used to stifle women's freedoms and restrain them, which is not in the least bit true. So since corsets have this misconception of being these terrible, painful, and ugly things, it's really nice to see them being adopted by an aesthetic that is focusing on beauty, elegance, and grace. However, there are a few differences between modern corsets and historical corsets that I'm going to get into now. For starters, modern corsets are usually worn on top of a dress or shirt rather than in the past where they would be worn on top of a chemise and then under a dress. There are other differences when it comes to the materials and making of the corsets used by those in the Royalcore aesthetic and historical corset wearers. For starters, traditionally, corsets would be boned using the bones of an animal, typically a whale, whereas modern corsets tend to use mostly plastic boning. I'm not saying that there aren't modern corset makers that use animal bones in their corsets, it's just that plastic boning has become a lot more popular. Another difference in the materials used to make the corsets would be the fabric itself. Historically, corsets would be made out of natural fibers since those would be the only ones available. But modern corset makers have a bunch more different materials at their disposal, including synthetic fibers, which are usually cheaper than their natural counterparts. Back to what I was saying before, the difference between how the corsets would be worn is definitely worth mentioning. Historically, corsets are worn as a supportive undergarment similar to a bra. But for the Royalcore aesthetic and other aesthetics that incorporated corsets into their fashion, they are usually worn on top of a shirt or dress or as a shirt itself. Personally, I really like the look of the corset on top of shirts. I think that corsets are just such a beautiful garment that they deserve to be worn proudly. Of course, it's not just corsets that are being worn by the adapters of this aesthetic. Other boned garments, such as boned tops and dresses, are also becoming more popular, mostly thanks to the Royalcore aesthetic. Bone garments are exactly as they sound, garments with boning in them similar to that of the corset. These tops also help to provide structure and support similarly to the way that corsets do. When we look at the other tops worn by the participants of this aesthetic, we can see that they bear a stark contrast to corsets. These tops are a lot less structured than the corsets and boned tops that we were discussing earlier. That does not, however, mean that they look a lot less regal. These shirts are more flowing, using soft curves and draping instead of a boned stiffness to convey the same idea of royalty. These tops are usually in softer colors, such as white, cream, or pale pink, and a lot of them are made out of silk or satin materials, often embellished with bows or pearls and lace just to add to the regalness. The difference between the other tops of this aesthetic and corsets are explained when we look at the time periods in which the Royalcore aesthetic draws its information from. The Royalcore aesthetic draws most of its inspiration from the 5th and 6th centuries and the 16th century. The fashion of the 16th century is very rigid and structured, and corsets were definitely utilized during that time period. When we look at clothing from the 5th and 6th centuries, also known as the Arthurian period, we can see that it is a lot more flowing and less structured, which is drastically different from the clothing of the 16th century. The clothing of this time is very loose and very flowing, which we can see reflected in the clothing of the Royalcore aesthetic. A key part of the clothing of the Arthurian period is the sleeves. While they may not be as heavily decorated as the sleeves of the Tudor period, they are still not in any way less elegant. These sleeves instead rely on their shape for their iconicness. The sleeves of Arthurian gowns are very long and large and flowing. They'd be wide and very open at the ends, and they are just overall beautiful. These sleeves are very drapey and give off a very magical look. Necklines of period dresses are also rather simple, and it's usually just a simple rounded or square neckline. Of course, whenever adapting historical clothing into a modern setting, not everything is kept entirely accurate so as to better modernize the historical fashion for a new audience. So not everything popular in the time periods mentioned will be translated into this aesthetic. I found that these tops were a lot more extravagant than the clothing from Arthurian times. Most of the clothing from the time period is lacking decoration just because of the lack of technology at the time. However, in the age we're living in, we have access to all these different things that we can accessorize our clothing with, and we have different ways of constructing garments and decorating them to have more of a modern touch while still maintaining some of the elements that made the Arthurian period recognizable. These elements are things such as the sleeves, simple colors, and natural themes such as floral and plant elements. I cannot talk about the Royalcore aesthetic without mentioning dresses. The garment is a very prominent part of the fashion of this aesthetic, and I feel that when we're looking at the dresses, there is such a broad spectrum when it comes to the formalness of them. Some dresses are rather casual and a lot more looser, taking more inspiration from the Arthurian period, while on the other end of the spectrum we have more rigid ball gowns that are heavily decorated and bear more resemblance to the fashion of the Tudor period. I've gathered some pictures of dresses from Pinterest, and I'm just going to be placing them on a little scale that I have made and just talking about how they all fit in the aesthetic and why I've placed them where they are, just so we can get an appreciation for the wide range of dresses that are available to the participants of the aesthetic. First one that I'm going to be looking at is this white one. I'm going to put it rather low on scale since it is a rather simple dress. The style of dress can almost fit into the cottagecore aesthetic and is definitely on the more simplistic side. The second dress definitely looks a lot more regal than the first. It's definitely not a dress that you would see out and about, and it is a lot more structured, while still maintaining a gentle look. There is a lot of lace and ruffles on the gown, and it also looks rather flowy. I place this dress higher on the scale just because it is certainly not a simple dress and not something that you would see out every day. This next dress is yet another simpler one, this time with a bit more structure. The dress has more of a defined waistline and neckline and seems slightly more formal than the one to the left of it. It is still slightly lower on the scale because it still isn't that extravagant and is still a rather simple dress that you might see someone wearing out and about. The final dress that we're going to be taking a look at is placed a bit higher on the scale here. This dress has a lot more detail, having some floral designs and having a lot more detail when it comes to construction with the different fabrics for the different parts of the dress. Now, you may want to incorporate more of this aesthetic into your day-to-day wardrobe, but not want to have to wear a large fancy dress out and about. In this final segment of the video, I'm going to be talking about ways that you could incorporate the Royalcore aesthetic into your wardrobe. I'm going to be talking about some basic things that would probably be best to incorporate into your wardrobe to add that little royal touch to it. These are the kind of pieces that you would want to invest in if you're planning on adopting this aesthetic. The first item is an important Royalcore wardrobe staple, a simple white dress. The silhouette of the dress isn't too important, but a dress with a long flowing skirt and then a more form-fitting top definitely looks super regal, which is the look that this aesthetic is going for. I would recommend something with a puffed or more full sleeve just to add the whimsical nature. The second item would be a white top with either an interesting neckline or sleeve design. The top could have a slight pattern to it or have some lacy details, but you still want to maintain an elegant look. Another clothing piece to have would be a corset. This could either be a corset top or a regular corset. I'd recommend purchasing your corset from Etsy or making it yourself so that it fits you perfectly. You can buy mass-produced corsets from places like Amazon, but they would not be made to fit your exact measurements, making it a bit of a guessing game whether it'll be comfortable or not. Now I'm going to be talking about jewelry a little bit. The types of jewelry that I saw most often were pearl necklaces and more dainty and delicate silver necklaces, and along with gold ones, which often were layered. You could also find necklaces that were a combination of gold and pearls, which are just absolutely gorgeous in my opinion. So the best way to incorporate the jewelry from the aesthetic into your wardrobe would be to invest in a pair of pearls or a simple gold and silver chain or layered necklace. And that completes my look into the Royalcore aesthetic. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and learned something. I know that this one was a bit longer, so thank you for sticking with me until the end. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again soon. I love you all so much. Bye, guys!